Uh, Greetings to you all. It's wonderful to be with all of you this Friday evening. For us, it's Saturday early morning. So good to be with all of you today, and really thanking God for this opportunity and also this movement that is being led. Thank God for this wonderful initiative. Prayer is the need of the hour, fellowship is the need of the hour, and it's good to see all of you come together. And I'm glad that I could also join today. Uh, I know, as Pastor Jovan said, I know some of the faces look familiar. A lot of names look familiar, but faces look a little different. So, but it's good to come together in the presence of the Lord. And as Jovan said, we're going to be looking at the the book of First John as a series of Bible study for the next coming few weeks. Now, I don't want to take away much time introducing. Jovan gave an introduction already. Joel and my wife is Anne. We have been part of the Bangalore church for the past few years, and we've been ministering here in Bangalore among the youth for a few, almost 7 to 8 years now. So God has been helping us, leading us, and it is good to see some of our friends who are with our youth group going to different parts of the world, and more than going different parts of the world, doing greater things to wherever they have gone. So I really thank God for what He's doing in our midst. So today I don't want to take much time as introduction. I want to jump right in to First John. So I'm sure First John is a book that all of us would have read at least once in our life. Maybe if you're new to faith, maybe you haven't reached there. It's the book that comes towards the end of the Bible. So, uh, you know, we've read it multiple times. So today, what I want to do, and for the next few weeks, what I want to do with this Bible study. Now, when you talk about Bible study, when we talk about learning, we limit it to an informational experience. Okay, now the things that I say, most of it you might already know, some things might be new. And we look at it as an informational experience. Oh, I learned a couple of things today. That's good. That's what happens in a study. But my prayer and my desire is that more than it being an informational experience, it would be the way that I live my life. It would be instruction. It would be guidance. What we want to learn from First John is guidance on how we live as Christians in a world that is so different than all of us. So my prayer is that after learning from First John, that our lives would change. Our living would change. Our Christian life would be different. Our walk with the Lord would be different. Our interaction with the world would be different. The way I look at faith, the way I look at the world would be different from where I started in. So we know this book of First John. Now, First John is a letter. First John is a letter. So one of the first things to understand First John even better when you read also is to read it together. As we begin this Bible study, I want to keep that as a foundation because this is the letter. Now we live in a time of text messages and emails. I think emails have also become thing of the past now. It's all text messages, and so I don't know how many of you here have written letters to somebody on a paper with a pen. So when you write a letter, when you write a long letter, you read it together to understand the context. You read it together to understand the meaning. If I put it in today's context, if I send you a long text, if you read the first 5 lines and then the next 5 lines you read the next day, the next 5 lines you read the next day, you wouldn't exactly understand the meaning of what I'm trying to communicate. So a letter, an email, or a long text is something that has to be read together. So First John being a letter, the best way to understand First John is to read all of it together. The verses and the chapter division, it came much later. Verses and chapters were introduced, if I'm not wrong, somewhere around the late 16th century is when the verses and chapters were introduced. So it is easier for us to read. But so many times we have limited our Bible reading to I'm going to read 10 verses, I'm going to read 15 verses. Good. In a busy world, if you get to read at least that much, it's good. But for our studies, when we want to learn more from the word, it's always good to read it together as the letter. Now, this letter of John was written somewhere around 85 to 90 AD. Now, John, the author, the person who wrote this, he also wrote 5 other books. So, in other words, 20%, almost 20% of the New Testament is written by John. So he's the author who's authored almost 20% of the New Testament. Now, John, the author, we know he was very close to Jesus. He was somebody who was very, very close to Jesus. Now, Jesus had a lot of disciples. Jesus had a lot of this, a multitude that followed him, out of which Jesus had his 12, which he chose by name, which we know as the 12 disciples. So he has a bigger group, and then there's this group of 12 that we know as the disciples. And in that, Jesus had a group of three. We read many times in the Bible, Jesus had like a core group of three disciples out of all. So that was Peter, James, and John. Three people who were out of the big crowd, out of the 12, they were very close to Jesus in his ministry. Now, we read throughout the Gospels that there were some moments in the life of Jesus, in the ministry of Jesus, where there was only these three present, not everybody else. We read in the when Jesus went to raise Jairus' daughter, inside the room we read there's only three disciples, Peter, James, and John. So John was one among them. We read that on the Mount of Transfiguration, there was only three, and John was one among them. In the Garden of Gethsemane, John was one among the very few. What does that mean? In other words, John was there for a lot of the most intimate moments of the life of Jesus. John was present during a lot of the intimate moments of Jesus' life. And another privilege or another honor that John had was John was at the cross with Jesus. We read about it in the Gospels towards the end of Jesus' life. John was at the foot of the cross. So, to give a little outlook of the author, this is the author. The author is not an ordinary man. He was one of the very closest friends of Jesus. He was there in some of the most important moments of Jesus' life. So he has seen Jesus very close. He never saw Jesus from a distance. He was not a distant observer. He was a very close proximity friend. So we read about John and James. In the Bible, they are known as the sons of Zebedee, or another name we know them as is the name of Boanerges, which simply means sons of thunder. Why did Jesus call them sons of thunder? Simply because that was their personality. Their personality, they weren't known for being gentle. They weren't known for being nice. They were just thunder. They were, because we read in the gospel, this John goes to Jesus and says, Jesus, I always like the story. He looks at Jesus. Now, Jesus is the savior of all humanity. Jesus came down. He's the Messiah. Jesus is the epitome of love and everything. And he looks Jesus dead in the eyes and he says, Jesus, can you bring down fire and destroy Samaria? Can you bring down fire and destroy these people? Now, the Jews hated the Samaritans. So I was like, he was somebody who had the audacity to ask Jesus to destroy a nation, destroy a place. So that was his default personality. And that was the default setting of John. It was all about destruction. It was all about bring down fire, burn them. So this John later becomes the apostle of love. Sometimes it's very ironic, sometimes it's very funny, but this John becomes the apostle of love. So you read about a man who is like, oh, it's fun to watch them burn and suffer. And then a few years later, you see him becoming the apostle of love. So how does this happen? How does one go from burn them, destroy them, to love them no matter what? So that is a big transformation we see in the Bible. It's a big transformation that we read in the life of John as well. So how does this happen? So in this book of First John, John talks a little bit about how the transformation happened. How do you go from this to this particular angle? Now, when John wrote this letter, he was around 80 years old. He was 80 years old. So keep in mind, when he's writing First John, he's very, very, very old. 80 years old at that time now. So because he was very old, because he was around 80 years old, his language is very simple. The language of John, First John, is very tender. It is very simple. It's simply exactly how a grandfather would talk to his grandchildren. That's the language, the style of language that John uses in his letter. He's very tender. He's very simple. When you study the Greek, study First John, the New Testament in Greek. So when usually in Bible colleges or when you study the New Testament in Greek, First John is the first letter that we learn, that they ask you to study, because it is the easiest language out of all the New Testament. It has the most simplest language of all the New Testament. He doesn't follow a lot of literature rules. He doesn't follow a lot of structure. It was just the sayings of a very old grandfather who loved his grandchildren. I'm sure all of us had. I'm sure maybe I hope all of you had grandparents who you would sit next to and they would tell you stories. There was no big literature structure. They didn't care about the literature language or the structure. They just it came from a place of love. It came from their heart. So which is why in First John you see a lot of themes being repeated multiple times. John keeps saying the same things over and over and over again. If you have experience with your grandparents, we see when people get beyond a certain age, 80, 85, when they get older, you start to notice that they tend to repeat what they say again and again because maybe somewhere their memory is not staying as strong as much. So they tend to repeat things. So John in First John is very old man repeating a lot of different things. A simple way that I would look at First John is the other epistles, all the other letters. They looked at multiple things from one angle. They looked at multiple things from one angle, but John looks at one thing from multiple angles. So John looks at the theme of John is only one. He looks at one thing, but he looks at it from different angles. He gives us different point of views. He gives us different ideas of how to look at this one particular theme. Now, as we know, he was the youngest disciple of Jesus. So, if you calculate the history, right, he was probably somewhere in his late teens or very early youth when he started to follow Jesus. So maybe somewhere between 18 to 22 or 23. That was around the age when John started to follow Jesus. So when we read, so the context of how First John is written or the way it was done is so now keep in mind John was very young when he started to follow Jesus. He was the youngest, which means he lived the longest. So he was one of the last living apostles from the original group of Jesus. From that original group, he was one of the last living apostles. So how historians say that John, so they would carry John. He couldn't walk after when he was 80 plus old. He couldn't walk, so they would carry him in a chair and take him from congregation to congregation. They would take him from church to church. They would literally carry him because he couldn't walk. They would carry him on a chair. Now, because it was John, because he was the last disciple, the last apostle that lived in that time, people would gather in big number. People would gather in big number because he was the last one who was part of the core group of Jesus. So historians said that when John would go to a church, for example, imagine this is a physical, say right now we have an online guy, say imagine this is a physical church happening in one place. For I don't know a lot of European places, I'm going to use India as an example. Say in Bangalore, there's a church. So there would be announcements going around saying John is going to preach in your church on Sunday. People would gather from all around Bangalore. They would come and they would lift John on a chair. So John would be lifted on a chair. He would be this old man sitting in a chair and he would just preach to the congregation. He would preach to the church. And then they would take him to, I don't know, Bombay or maybe Chennai the next week. And people from all over that land would come there and they would raise him again on a chair and he would preach to the congregation. Now, when people came, he would lift his face and he would start to teach them. So now John didn't give, now keep in mind, there's a very, very old man who doesn't have a lot of energy. John didn't give 40, 45 minutes, 1 hour sermon and all. He didn't give a long, 3.5 point PPT sermon. No, John never did any of that. John would lift his head. He would look at the people and say, little children, love one another. He would say, love one another. That's the whole point of John's sermon. He didn't give a lot of theological explanation, or he didn't dissect the word, or he didn't do any of that. He would look at the congregation. In Bangalore, he would look at the crowd and say, children, love one another. He would go to Chennai, he would say, children, love one another. He'd go to Kerala, the next state, and say, children, love one another. That is the whole theme of John's sermon. In fact, there's a recording in history where somebody went and asked Apostle John, he says, why do you say only this thing wherever you go? Towards his later life, somebody asked, why do you only say this wherever you go? And he said, if they do only that, that is enough. So the answer to somebody asking, why do you keep saying love one another? Why don't you say anything else? He said, if they do only that, that is enough. So that's a whole teaching of John. That's the whole sermon of John. It's all about love. It is all about loving one another. It is all about loving God. Simply put, Paul wrote his epistles to the churches. John wrote his epistles to families. Paul's was always addressed to a church, to the church at Corinth, to the church at Rome, to the church at Philippi, to the church at Colossians. So different churches, the letters were sent to. For John, he spoke to families. So the congregation that came in one particular, he would look at individuals, he would look at families, and he would share what God had put in his heart. Now, as I said, he's the last surviving apostle, and First John is the last book written in the New Testament chronologically. This is the last book to be ever written in the New. He wrote it after Revelation. Revelation deals with the end times and everything. So, because it deals with the end times, it's placed in the end in our Bibles. But chronologically, this was written much after that. Now, John's name, to be honest, only appears in the title. Uh, Nowhere else it's mentioned that John wrote this or anything. But when you're the last surviving apostle, people already know you. You don't have to keep saying, "Hey, this is John writing." No, people know who you are because you're one of the last surviving apostles. So, uh, one theme that you see across the writings, all writings of John, and especially the Gospel of John. So, First John is compared very much to the Gospel of John. So people find a lot of similarity between Gospel of John and First John. The style is similar, the substance is similar, the sources are similar, and at least 10 identical phrases, happen in John, the Gospel of John, and First John. If you go back and do like a comparative study, you'll know that almost 10 identical phrases appear in both of these books. So, get into why the First John was written, why John had the desire of writing a letter like this. Now, sometimes when you read something, you may not understand it immediately. You may not get it. Now, I don't know about you, but for me, science and math is something that I still struggle with. My sister is a physics teacher, so last week she had bought her class exam mark sheets, the answer sheets home, and she was sitting at home and correcting. And I just took one paper and I read it, and I was like, I didn't understand a word that was written in that paper. I had no clue. Like the kids wrote their answers. The questions was that I didn't understand any word. So I'm like, I just kept it back, like this is not my area. So sometimes you read something you may not understand, but because John was an old man and because he was a grandfather, he very clearly tells you why he's writing this. Many of the episodes you have to read, okay, why did Paul write this? Why did Peter write this? What is the purpose behind this? What's the meaning behind this? What's the objective behind this? You have to scrutinize it to understand why it was written. But with John, it was very clear. In 4 or 5 verses in this entire letter, he says, I'm writing because of this. I'm writing because of this. He's very clearly, he spells it out. So you don't have to go and do like a detail, okay, why did he do it? No, it is very clearly written, I am writing because of this. In verse 1, verse 4, it says, we write this for this dash. In chapter 2, verse 1, my dear children, I write this to you. So dash. In 2:26, he says, I'm writing these to you because of this. In 5:13, he says, I write. So as I said, multiple places, John is very clearly saying, I'm writing it because of these things. So John makes it very easy. As I said, First John, in that sense, becomes one of the most easiest letters for us to understand and to live. Now, get to the theme or the main message of First John, and I want to look at chapter 1 for today, depending on our time. Now, this letter is not a regular letter. This letter is not, John didn't write to ask about how people are doing, how everyone is doing. This is known as a confrontational letter. This letter was very confrontational in its nature. So when you read First John chapter 1, and in fact, all of these chapters, but mainly chapter 1, John very clearly calls out sloppy Christian living. John is directly addressing the people and saying, and he calls out, he's saying, my dear children, in simply, you guys are living very sloppy Christian lives. Now, John writes his letter to the believers, telling them how to live life. He's telling how a believer must live his life. Now, I want to take you back to a little history lesson. Now, this was written around, as I said, around that AD. So, in the first century, somewhere around 85 to 90 AD, there was this concept of Gnosticism. There's this concept of Gnosticism. Now, it was a very strong concept in the first few centuries, and it was a heresy. It was a wrong teaching. And at that time, this wrong teaching plagued the church. This wrong teaching was strongly, this churches were strongly affected by this wrong teaching. And this originated from the teachings of Plato, the philosopher. He is the one who originated this teaching, but slowly this creeped into the church, setting. This creeped into the life of Christians living in those times. Now, Greek word Gnostics means knowledge. So Gnostic in Greek means knowledge. So simply, it means knowledge was the way to salvation. This was the theory. This was the theory. This was the ideology that existed at the time. In other words, knowledge was the way to salvation. In other words, if I can accumulate knowledge, I can gain salvation. So Plato came up with this idea, and Greeks all around the world believed it. Greeks were known for knowledge. We look at history, we read about the Romans being good at infrastructure and things like that. You see the Arabs being good at some things. Greeks were known for knowledge. All your famous philosophers were Greeks. All your famous language experts were Greeks. So Greeks believed in also. They believed if you can accumulate a lot of knowledge, you gain salvation. So this started to creep into the church. So there is people who started to question salvation. There are people who started to question what Jesus did for his people on the cross. The deeper root of what it means is it thinks physical. So knowledge is a very physical thing to gain. So it thinks about physical understanding. So Gnostics, one of the main things the Gnostics believed that they believed Jesus wasn't physical because they believed everything physical is evil. So they didn't believe that Jesus was real. They believed that they dismissed or they completely ignored the incarnation of Jesus. They didn't believe Jesus came down. They didn't believe Jesus died. They didn't believe that Jesus was a person. They dismissed it, saying that Jesus never existed. Jesus was just a myth. They believed Jesus was like a phantom or a spirit. They didn't believe that he was a real person of flesh, but they believed just that he was a spirit. And now, if you read in First Corinthians 8, Paul also addresses the Gnostics of those times, the Gnostics that existed in that time. Paul had a lot of debates with them. We read that in First Corinthians. I don't have time to get into that. So Gnosticism somewhere started to get inside the church. Now, some believers, now these are not regular believers, these are church attending strong believers who started to slowly take on this ideology of Gnosticism in their hearts. They started to question Jesus. And that's why John begins this letter addressing to the church saying, that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon. In other words, John is looking at this group of Gnostics who've entered into the church. He looks at this Gnostic ideology who believes that Jesus wasn't real, that Jesus was a phantom or a spirit, that Jesus didn't really exist. John looks at them and says, that which we have seen, that which we have. John is saying, I touched him. I lived with him. I walked with him. He was from the beginning. He was the God who became man. So John begins the letter by saying, you guys are wrong. Why? Because I saw him. I touched him. I lived with him. He's not a phantom. He is not a spirit. He is God in flesh. The word, the one that John emphasizes on is which we have looked at. The Greek word that is used there is a word called theomai, from which the word theater comes from. Today we have the word theater. It comes from the Greek word theomai. It simply means to gaze upon for a long time, or in other words, to study. So John is saying he was from the beginning. I have seen him. I have heard him. I have gazed upon him for a long time. He is real. So John is trying to establish to the church, establish to the Gnostic community of that time, saying, what do you think is wrong? What you're saying is wrong. He is real. He is true. So when John is saying, when he's writing this, he's saying, I was at the foot of the cross. I was there when the blood was pouring out. I was there when he cried in agony. I was there when he gave up his life and died on the cross. He's saying he's not a phantom. He's not an illusion. He's not a spirit. He is not what you think he is. He is real. And John introduces or reintroduces who Jesus is to a community that is Gnostic. He says Jesus is not what you think he is. Jesus is not who you think he is. Jesus is real. And John, as I said, him being the last living apostle is gives him a lot of credibility. When I say, "Oh, I know Jesus," and John saying he knows Jesus, it's a little different. John saw him. So John is telling Jesus is not who you think he is. He is what the Bible says he is. He is what God says he is. And today, maybe Gnosticism, back in the day when the Gnostics, they believed that you can do whatever you want physically, it doesn't matter. The only important thing is what you do spiritually. Now, that's one of the biggest teachings of the Gnostics. So you can live life however you want physically, as long as you feel good inside, you are good. As long as you feel good spiritually. Now, this was the influence that started to happen in the church. So, because of this ideology, because of this theology, or this doctrine, people started to live a sloppy Christian life. In other words, they started to do whatever they wanted physically without caring for it. Because Gnostics said you can do whatever you want physically, it doesn't matter. What matters is spirituality. What matters is what you are inside. Now, to that crowd, John is writing this letter. Now, Gnosticism doesn't exist today in that sense of ideology or philosophically, but somewhere in today's churches, in today's believers, the root of this thought have come into our hearts, unfortunately. A lot of churches, a lot of believers have this thought in their mind. It is that it is all about the spirit. It is all about how I am inside. It doesn't matter how I behave on the outside, or it doesn't matter what I do on the outside, as long as I feel good inside. That is Gnosticism. That was the doctrine, that was the philosophy that Paul was against, that was the philosophy that John was against, that was the philosophy the apostles were against. But whatever they was against, today somewhere have creeped into our ideologies, to our churches, to our believers, to our thinking. But it doesn't matter what I do on the outside. It doesn't matter how I live, as long as I feel good inside. That's what the Gnostics believed. You can do whatever you want as long as you felt good inside. Church, today, when we look at this ideology that is creeped into our churches or our believers, unfortunately, this is what John was writing against. To that crowd, John was writing, John is saying it is not about just the inside. It is also about how you are outside. The moment why I think First John is one of the most important letters of today's age. One of the most important letters of today's age is because of this very precise reason. We live in a world that doesn't care what they do outside as long as they feel good inside. And we're trying to make people feel good. Churches are trying to make people feel good. Believers are trying to make each other feel good. At the end of the service, when I go back from a church, how are you going back? Are you going back feeling good, or are you going back transformed? Are you going back with the right thinking? Today, we are too focused on making people feel good. That was what John was against. And today, in a lot of the places, we see that. At the end of the day, oh, that felt good. No, Bible is not supposed to be something that is felt good. It is something to be lived. It is not exactly to be it's not about feeling. It is good to be feeling good. It's good to have feelings in your heart when you talk about the Bible and you talk about God. But more than that, it is about living right. So the Gnostics, they stopped at feeling good. They didn't care about the living right. They stopped at feeling nice inside. They didn't care about the living well part. And John was writing to that crowd. Time is going, so I'm going to rush. The moment we get saved, the moment we accept Jesus, there's a battle that starts inside of our heart. Now, before your heart belongs to Jesus, before you belong to Jesus, you could do whatever you wanted to do. There was no conflict. There was no battle. Before you were in Jesus, you can do whatever you wanted, whatever you thought, whatever you felt like doing, you could do. The moment you accept Jesus to your heart, the moment you bring Jesus into the picture, there starts to have a conflict. Earlier, it was only one. Now there's two, and there's a conflict. So now you cannot say the things that you used to say before because there's a conflict that's pulling you towards the right. You couldn't do the things that you could do before because there's somebody else pulling you to the other side. You can't go to the places that you've been before Now there is a conflict that is happening in other words, our moral consciousness is heightened. So now, since we belong to God, therefore it is His rules. When we belong to God, it is His rules. Now, anybody can go around and say, I believe in Jesus. But what John is trying to tell is, you can say that you believe in Jesus all you want. But if your behavior doesn't match your belief, then it is not sincere. If your belief doesn't match your behavior. So first John is trying to tell that. John is trying to say, you say with your mouth, you're saying, oh, I believe in Jesus. I believe that He is a Savior. I believe that He is God. But your behavior doesn't match your belief. And John is writing against that culture. Today, unfortunately, that's the culture. What we believe in sometimes doesn't match the way we live life. I might say God is love. I believe that God is love. But where is love in my life? I believe that God is holy. But where is holiness in my life? I believe God is pure. But where is purity in my life? I believe God loves everybody. God forgives. God is a forgiving God. I believe that. But where is forgiveness in my life? I believe that God is peace. But where is peace in my life? So, in today's time, also, our belief sometimes doesn't match our behavior. And John is writing to Christians like that. John is writing to Christians like that, saying, if your belief doesn't match your behavior, then it is not sincere faith. It is not sincere. It's as simple like I said. John didn't use fancy languages. He was simple. He got to the point and he said, if your belief doesn't match your behavior, it is not sincere. I will close with just one more thing from this chapter. Now, John uses the word sincere. He used the word sincere faith. Now, in the Latin word, sincere comes from two words. It comes from the word scenic and sera. Scenic means without, and sera means was. I'll give an example on why this word came to be. In the first century, the Romans would make statues. They would make idols or statues from things. So I don't know if you've seen statues being made up close. They use a chisel. So they would use it, they would keep a chisel and then hit. And they would hammer it slowly and they would chisel out and carve out an image. Sometimes, if it is an unskilled, person who's making it, sometimes one hard hit, you might something, for example, say you're creating this, my face, and maybe you're sculpting or chiseling. Sometimes you came here, you chisel a little too hard, the nose came off. Okay, so you have a sculpture with no nose. So what they would do is they would take wax and they would place it and polish it the same color. So when somebody looks at it, they wouldn't know the difference. So a beautiful, if it's made out of granite, it would be the granite. They would give the wax a gray color. So they would have a beautiful wax, but the nose is missing. So they would put wax there and the wax would be there, and then that completes the sculpture. So people would pay huge amount of money. They would buy this portrait or this sculpture, and they would go home and they would keep it at home. But after a few days, when the sun's heat comes out, this wax starts to melt. And after 1 week, they realize, oh wait, the nose is missing because of the heat, the nose starts to melt off. Or maybe if it's a year, the ear starts to melt. So whatever adjustments they did to the sculpture, after a few days of heat, would slowly start to melt. And that's when people would realize, oh, this is a fake sculpture. I paid a lot of money for a fake sculpture. So from there is what this word sincera comes from. In other words, we get the word sincere. So it means legit. It means authentic without wax. That's the whole meaning of that. It's authentic without any wax. So it's not. There's no adjustments here and there. There's no touch-ups here and there. There's no fake, additions here and there. It's sincere. It doesn't melt in the heat. The wax doesn't melt in the heat. So, to, so this is the understanding of it. This is from where we get that word. So that crowd, this grandfather John looks and writes, "My children, let your faith be sincere. Let your belief be sincere. Let it be authentic." That's as simple as that. As I said, he doesn't use fancy language. He's saying that is what Jesus called us to be. Jesus called us to be authentic. Jesus called us to be sincere. Jesus called us to be, not fake, no wax, nothing adjustments, to be authentic, to be sincere and authentic in our relationship. It is challenging. It is not easy in today's time. We live in a world that wants to dominate. We live in a world, a flesh that wants to dominate, a flesh that wants to rule, a flesh that wants to take over. But somewhere, sometimes we put a lot of wax, we put a lot of adjustments so that it looks perfect from the outside. It looks perfect. So when people look at me, oh, it looks, what a person, what a wonderful person. You know, we have that perfect image that we put before people. But today, God is telling, when you put it in the presence of the Lord, how much of it is going to melt away? How much of it is a build-up? How much of it is an adjustment? How much of it is a fakeness that I've applied? In front of people, beautiful sculpture. Perfect, beautiful, shines, wonderful. But the moment you put it next to heat, the moment you put it next to fire, you realize how much of that sculpture is real and authentic. Today, as we close, the question that John asked the people of those times, the question that I ask myself every single day, and the question that I want to leave with all of you is, how authentic is our faith? How sincere is our faith? How sincere is my relationship with the Lord? Many times we pretend a lot of things. We add a lot of things. But today, God is looking at us. God is looking at each and every single one of us and saying, your behavior has to match your belief. Today, a question we need to ask all of us is my belief matching my behavior? How am I to the outside world? I believe in God. Yes, I believe in everything God is. But is my life an example of what I believe in? Like many sometimes people say, do as I say, not as I do. Is my life like that? Am I just a Christian in my belief, or am I a Christian in my behavior as well? Because we live in a world that says it doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter how you are. You can behave however you want. You can do whatever you want. You can say whatever you want. You can go wherever you want. We live in that world who says it's okay. But we follow a God who says it's not okay. We believe in a God who says that is not how things are. That is not why I went to the cross. I went to the cross so you can be different. I went to the cross so you can be authentic. I went to the cross so that your faith can be sincere. As I said, more than the study being an informational experience, can we ask ourselves this question? God, I want I want this to transform my life. I want all of us to take a deep look into our lives. Only I know what's wax in my personality. You will never know. My close friends may not know. My wife may not know. The people around me may not know. But there might be some of us with some of our things very waxed up. But today, when we take it to the presence of God, today, what part of us is melting down? What part of us is fake? And when we scan it in the presence of the Lord, let God be the judge. And can we say to God, say, God, I want to have a sincere faith. I want to have an authentic faith. I want to have a belief that matches. When the world looks at me, they would know who I am and they would see who you are. That's the whole point of John. One of the main point that John was trying to get across. A people that lived life however they wanted. A Christians who lived very sloppy Christian life. And today, are we one of those sloppy Christians? Am I one of those Christians who's very, not sincere, who's not authentic, or who's not genuine in God's presence? Let's submit ourselves into God's hand. Let's give ourselves to the Lord and say, God, take me. Take account of my life. Take an inspection of my life. Take a deep look into my life. What are the places where I need a transformation? What are the areas where I need a touch of you? What are the areas where I need to be transformed so that I can be more closer to you? May God bless us with these words. Let these words continue to speak to us, and let it continue to transform our life. God bless.